Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tonight I rise in strong support of Bill C-62 that would delay by 3 years expanding medical assistance in dying for those for whom mental illness is the sole underlying condition. And my reasons for doing so are the same as they were my speech on C-39 1 year ago to this day, at the time when the government was only willing to delay by 1 year. First of all, because this delay aligns with what I've heard from so many folks in my community. Secondly, because we know this is what experts have been calling for some time. And third, because as Greens, we believe we should spend more time filling in our social safety net before we expand medical assistance in dying. Today, Greens also believe that we should be rushing this legislation before the March 17th deadline to ensure that MAID isn't expanded for mental illness as the sole underlying condition. Also because it's the next best thing to what Bill C-314 that was proposed by the member for Abbotsford would have done, which is avoiding this expansion for good. Substantively, though, the process we're in right now, by which this bill has to this point been moving ahead quite quickly, and I expect as votes fall over the coming days, will continue to based on the motion that was approved earlier in the day. This shows that this House of Commons can move quickly when there's an urgent priority to be addressed, as is the case with the March 17th deadline in the existing legislation. That really what this is about in terms of moving quickly isn't that we don't have the legislative tools to do it, but it's that we need the political will to do so. And so my question when I think about this legislation in front of us, outside of what I've shared so far in terms of why I'm supporting and why I have historically and why Greens have historically as well, is where is the rush to support legislation that would substantively improve the quality of life of Canadians? And other members have reflected and have shared feedback that I hope they've heard directly from people with disabilities across the country. But where is the rush on ending legislated poverty for people with disabilities? The fact is that to this day, 40% of people living in poverty across the country are people with disabilities. And while some will talk about a piece of legislation that was passed in June of last year, the fact is that by having that benefit not as of yet funded, and by not having engaged in and figured out negotiations with provinces and territories, today a person with a disability is no better off than before that legislation was passed. It is shameful. It's an embarrassment that in a country as rich as ours, that we're in a place where people with disabilities continue to live in legislated poverty. And this House of Commons could choose to act as urgently to end legislated poverty for people with disabilities as this House is moving right now to ensure that the March 17th deadline is met. This House of Commons could also push to actually address one of the core underlying issues here, which is a lack of supports to address mental health. In fact, it was in the last electoral campaign that the Liberal Party promised at the time a Canada mental health benefit. It was meant to be called the Canada Mental Health Transfer. It was a $4.5 billion commitment. And it wasn't one of many of several bullet points in a health accord the way we have now. Because one of the challenges, while we all want our health care to be delivered in a wholesome way, it's more helpful to have funding agreements that are specific so we can have accountability on it. Yet that's not the case when it comes to mental health. Instead, mental health is one of 4 bullet points in these provincial and federal agreements. And as a result, it's up to the provinces, and there's unclear any accountability whatsoever on how much of the dollars in those agreements are going to go directly to mental health. And in this year's budget, we could see this government step up and be more clear and say, no, you know what, we're going to make sure we directly fund what was supposed to be that Canada mental health transfer. And in so doing, substantively improve the quality of life of Canadians, of folks in my community who are waiting on unreasonable wait times and lists to get access to a mental health professional. If we were really serious about moving as quickly as we are here on another core crisis in this country, we'd move far more quickly on addressing the housing crisis. And again, for me, the little bit of hope I have seeing what's happening right now is that we know there are the parliamentary tools available to do exactly that. But the fact is, in my community, today we just had a report come out that continues to make calls with respect to dealing with people living rough in encampments. Well, in my community, the number of people living unsheltered has tripled in just the last 3 years. We shouldn't be in a place where that's happening, but you know why that's the case. Well, right now, for every one new unit of affordable housing getting built, we're losing 15 units to the financialization of housing, to the fact that housing has increasingly become a commodity for large institutional investors to trade rather than a place for a person to live. And that means we continue to see large institutional investors buying up existing affordable housing, renovating folks, increasing the rents, and then we wonder why that crisis is also getting worse. Well, I don't think we'd be at the place we are right now if this Parliament and this government in particular were to get more serious about addressing the housing crisis that we are in. Well, the fact is that after 30 years of underinvestments, where are we now? We're at the bottom of the G7 when it comes to the social housing stock in this country. 3.5% of our housing is social housing. It means that even if we were to double social housing, we'd only be around the middle of the pack in the G7. It means that after 30 years of underinvestment in communities across the country, we have folks, I'm thinking about someone I spoke with this past weekend, a nurse who was telling me she can't afford to live in our community as a result of the reality of the cost of housing. It means whether it's a teacher or it's a nurse or it's a tradesperson, that this is a generation that is fundamentally looking at housing differently than any one before it has. Why? Well, in my community, if you look back to 2005, the cost of housing has gone up 275% when wages have only gone up 42%. And once again, if we were to truly fill in the social safety net and move as quickly on doing that as this government has moved today on meeting this March 17th deadline, well, we could substantively ensure that we see the funding that's necessary to address the affordable housing crisis and also address the financialization, the fact that these institutional investors have swept in to make the biggest buck possible as quickly as possible on the backs of some of the lowest income people in my community. And so, yes, I'll be supporting C-62, and I think this is a really important opportunity for us all to mark that this Parliament can move quickly when it needs to on real crises that it sees. And we've got a crisis of housing, a crisis of legislated poverty for people with disabilities, and a crisis on mental health that this Parliament and this government should move a whole lot faster on.